Unhealthy fats in healthy populations. So does saturated fatty acid consumption actually matter in the conversation? Does it come with any kind of deleterious health effects, especially if you're healthy, you're fit, you're metabolically flexible? So Ansel Keys came up with his lipid hypothesis in 1953 based on some observational control trials that he ran. Really small sample sizes were used in these trials, though. It was a mixture of both human and animal models. And 1 to 1.5% of the kcals came from fat in some of these trials. So they really weren't very practical. They didn't really offer much nutritional value there. Anichkow in 1967 fed rabbits cholesterol and tried to link the changes that he saw in these rabbits to the atherosclerotic processes that we were observing in humans. So really loose connection between a four-legged herbivore and a human being there. 1970, the 7-country study, Ansel Keys tried to solidify his lipid hypothesis, try to draw causation from observational research here. Didn't consider the lifestyle habits of the populations, didn't consider the industrialization of some of these countries, which should have been considered here, and they weren't. So what happened was we set in motion cardiovascular disease increases, type 2 diabetes increases, rise in obesity. So what we were trying to avoid was actually propagated even faster. And this is what we got. We got white bread and we got I can't believe it's not butter and Fabio endorsing it under the guise of heart health. So the lipid hypothesis in 1953, again, loose correlation that was interpreted as causation, assumes that cholesterol is the only predictor and the most accurate predictor of atherosclerosis here. So the original data, Harcombe and colleagues went back and they looked at the randomized control trials and did not find any relationship between dietary fat intake and cardiovascular disease deaths. Despite significant reductions in cholesterol levels in both intervention and control groups, people still died. So cholesterol fell on average 12.6%, but people still died from cardiovascular events. She and colleagues, this was a meta-analysis based on a previous trial, 609 participants in that trial. The BMI was higher, it was 28 to 40. Participants were assigned to a healthy high fat diet or a healthy high carb diet randomly for 12 months. They maintained their current habits until the trial actually started. There was no baseline diet. 4 major data collection points throughout that. Triglycerides, they tended to decrease in the healthy high fat group only. When we look at LDL, we actually see a small increase, small but significant increase in the healthy high carb diet there, which is actually a little bit surprising. Shaw and colleagues in 2018 was a randomized control trial, 94 participants, so it was a fairly large sample size. It was a little bit of an older population though, 60 years of age. They were asked to consume 50 grams of coconut oil, olive oil, or butter for 4 weeks. There was no other supervision. It was here's your fats, here's your measuring cups to kind of help you out there. No other dietary changes were made. There were only 2 assessments, one pre, one post. So what we actually saw was a difference in butter. So butter tended to increase LDL cholesterol here, especially when compared to the other 2 groups. Coconut oil actually tended to significantly raise HDL cholesterol, especially compared to the other 2 groups here. Butter tended to increase the total cholesterol to HDL ratio, which is a common measure of cardiovascular disease risk. So it would appear as though type of fat matters in the conversation here. Kropotty and colleagues in 2019 investigated 9 quote-unquote healthy male participants in a randomized crossover design. They were either given a coconut oil-based diet for a period of 8 weeks or a peanut oil-based diet for a period of 8 weeks with a 6-week washout period in between. Except for the fat source, all of the diet was exactly the same. So we actually saw quite a bit of changes here in the coconut oil-based group. HDL tended to increase, LDL tended to decrease. Total cholesterol to HDL ratio, which is a common metric of assessment of cardiovascular disease risk, improved. We saw the exact opposite in the peanut oil-based diet here. Clark in 1997 did a meta-analysis of some metabolic ward studies. Does indicate a positive relationship, at least it seems, with saturated fatty acid intake and cholesterol levels. Bullock and colleagues took offense to this in 2008. Looking at this 10 to 15% intake range here, it does appear as though it could go in either direction. There is a chance of cholesterol lowering with lowered saturated fatty acid intake, but the inverse is also true. So that pink area in that dotted line there at 15% might actually indicate a 15% threshold, where beyond which we are going to start to see some accelerated rates of cholesterol increase. Now, that does actually assume that cholesterol matters in this conversation, which it very well may not. So it's generally accepted that LDL cholesterol is arthrogenic in nature. Narada and colleagues started to look at this a little bit, and they actually found that HDL was inversely related to fasting glycemia and IMT thickness. They also found that small LDL cholesterol was associated with increased mRNA expression of pro-inflammatory molecules. That's not to say that LDL molecules by themselves are not inflammatory, not arthrogenic, but the size and buoyancy of these particles may actually matter here. Kang and colleagues in 2020 looked at LDL, they looked at saturated fatty acid intake, they looked at IMT thickness, and what they actually found was that for every 10 grams per day of saturated fatty acid intake was associated with an average reduction of 6% in relative stroke risk. And there was actually only 3 studies that actually pointed the opposite. So maybe, just maybe, we can look at this as a positive as it relates to ITM and stroke risk with saturated fatty acid intake. Ruiz-Nunez and colleagues note that the reduction of LDL-C from lowered saturated fatty acid intake appears to be specific for the large, buoyant, low-density lipoproteins. Cowan and Cattleman did a review on this topic. Saturated fatty increases particle size of LDL-C, and the larger LDL-C particles are apparently less prone to oxidation and therefore less inflammatory. It's not to say that these aren't inflammatory in and of themselves, they're not arthrogenic. It's just to say that maybe size does matter with regards to this topic. So in order to kind of summarize things, Schwing-Schwackel and Hoffman here actually did a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized control trials, which investigated the long-term effects of high versus low-fat diets. 32 trials made the cut here. So total cholesterol and LDL showed significant decreases in high carbohydrate diets, good confidence interval there. Lower LDL showed a moderate association with decreased saturated fatty acid intakes. HDL tended to increase in high-fat diets, and triglycerides tended to decrease in those high-fat diets. HDL was associated with total fat intake as opposed to saturated fat intake itself. So it appears as though the total daily fat load matters more than the saturated fat intake itself. Increases in triglyceride were associated with carbohydrate intake, and we're going to get into that with some de novo lipogenesis stuff here. Lower total cholesterol is associated with lower saturated fat intake, but also with higher PUFA intake. So is it what's replacing saturated fat that matters? It might actually. So it was observed as early as the 1960s that very low fat diets resulted in hypertriglyceridemia. So if we knew that back then, why were low fat diets being pushed as late as the early 90s? So saturated fatty acid status. It's a characteristic of circulating triglycerides. May be defined as the amount of circulating fatty acids in the blood, specifically the saturated fatty acids, and it's measured typically by the amount that's bound to erythrocytes, plasma phospholipids, or cholesterol esters. Carbohydrates in excess of storage and oxidative capacity, particularly under conditions of insulin resistance, readily stimulates hepatic de novo lipogenesis. So we know that saturated fatty acids and dietary fat itself may not increase triglyceride values, but maybe we can shift our focus towards dietary fat load and carbohydrate intake. So Ruiz-Nunez in both 2014 and 2016 noted that saturated fatty acid status is positively correlated with that total cholesterol to HDL ratio that is commonly used. Saturated fatty acid intake actually does not correlate. There is a discrepancy between saturated fatty acid intake and saturated fatty acid status, which might derive from endogenous saturated fatty acid synthesis from carbohydrate. It is actually important to note that de novo lipogenesis may also occur from adipose tissue. So if you are over fat and overfed, this does become an issue here. So in looking at factors relating to saturated fatty acid status versus intake, Volk and colleagues in 2014 noted that higher carbohydrate intakes may actually stimulate de novo lipogenesis, particularly among those with impaired abilities to oxidize glucose. Higher proportions of palmitic acid in the blood are actually associated with increased risks of heart disease, and higher proportions of blood saturated fatty acid and palmitoleic acid are actually associated with glucose intolerance and cardiovascular disease. So King in 2006 actually investigated this high carbohydrate versus moderate carbohydrate diets in 66 postmenopausal women who were randomly assigned to either that low fat or moderate fat diet there. And they found significant changes in palmitic acid were observed in high carbohydrate groups specifically. It is important to note that there are gender differences within this study that limit the generalizability of the data. It's important to account for that de novo lipogenesis via adipose tissue in the discussion, because females do carry a little bit more adipose tissue here. Volk and colleagues in 2014 investigated this a little bit further. 16 adults with metabolic syndrome here, though, fed 6 different diets, each of which lasting 3 weeks in length. They progressively increased in carbohydrate and they decreased in dietary fat as they went on here. So we see changes with those stepwise increases in that C14 and C16 myristic and palmitic, and we also see palmitoleic acid increase. Surprisingly, though, 14 and 16.1 are significant. No significant changes in that palmitic acid, though, that's C16, which are actually quite surprising. Arslan and colleagues in 1998 set out to investigate this a little bit further in a hypercaloric environment. They investigated 5 healthy men, so it was a small sample size here, for 4 days in a metabolic ward environment to check out de novo lipogenesis. So they used intravenous infusion, both day and night, nasogastric feeding, and IV glucose infusion here. 83% of it was glucose via carbohydrate, 15% from amino acids, and only 2% came from fat. So it was a high glycemic study. These people were completely sedentary. It was in a metabolic ward. So the authors found that palmitic acid significantly increased through the course of the study as individual VLDL bound to fatty acids. Palmitoleic also increased there. And then we also see secretion of preformed VLDL triglyceride fatty acids increase. And then lastly, we also see de novo secretion of de novo synthesized triglycerides increase. Again, this was a high glycemic carbohydrate-based diet here. Marquez Lopez and colleagues in 2012 set out to investigate this as well. 13 males, 6 of which were considered quote unquote lean. They were 15.4% body fat though, 7 of which were overweight, 26.7% body fat. So it was, again, a really small sample size here. 3-day baseline isoenergetic period prior to the intervention. 80% of carbohydrate was administered. Sucrose and lactose was the primary type there. So what the authors found was a correlation between the average de novo lipogenesis and the rise in triglyceride with higher percentages of body fat. Again, this is another quote unquote healthy population, but with a high glycemic type of carbohydrate. Swartz and colleagues, 2003, lean normal insulin levels and obese normal insulin levels versus hyperinsulinemic obese people. There were 33 males involved in this study. It was a 5-day metabolic ward, and the majority of the carbohydrates that came from this diet were in the form of soft drinks and in sucrose. So it was a high glycemic condition there. We are seeing a correlation between those with the highest triglyceride levels and de novo lipogenesis. We're also seeing that de novo lipogenesis actually increased in lean normal insulin level individuals and obese hyperinsulinemic individuals there as well. But low external validity of this study, right? It was a metabolic ward study. The lean were on average of 166 pounds with at least 17% body fat here. So they're likely above their fat threshold. And the authors can't discount that some of the de novo lipogenesis that it was seen didn't come from adipose tissue in either of these groups. So in the context of a metabolic ward study where you're above your fat threshold, this doesn't tell us much how it might affect really strong, really active individuals with a lot of muscle tissue here. So Ruiz and Nunez and colleagues in 2014 interviewed and collected self-reported data from healthy participants across Eastern Africa and also the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is supposed to have a diet that's very similar to a westernized diet. So we got fatty acid intake here on the left-hand side, and then we've got status versus intake. So what we see is non-significant changes that are observed with saturated fatty acid intake and saturated fatty acid status, which is bound to LDL cholesterol. We see a saturated fatty acid intake, which is negatively associated with status, that's bound to HDL. And we see increases in saturated fatty acid status with increases in C14 and C16, which will positively associate with that total cholesterol to HDL ratio. So in order to summarize here a little bit, the World Health Organization in 1994 came out and actually said that there was no relationship between total cholesterol and cardiovascular disease risk. Saturated fatty acid intake is not associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, or coronary heart disease. And that's from Siri and colleagues in 2010. High glycemic load carbohydrate consumed in a hypercaloric context may elicit adverse changes in saturated fatty acid status, particularly in those that with impaired abilities to oxidize glucose. So if you actually are metabolically ill, this is going to be a thing. Shifting our focus a little bit, Poppet and colleagues 2008 investigated saturated fatty acids and dietary fat load with inflammatory markers. They investigated 18 healthy males, double-blind randomized control trial. They provided a high-fat test meal containing butterfat in either a high saturated fat to unsaturated fat ratio or a low ratio. And that low ratio exchanged saturated fat for monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. So we actually see a significant increase with the main effect for time here, but not significant between groups in IL-6. TNF alpha actually decreased significantly in the high ratio group only. Mu and colleagues in 2014 investigated 55 generally healthy adults. It was a randomized control trial. All participants in the study, though, did have periodontitis, so they did already have an inflammatory condition, and they all received aspirin in the study. So that is a confounding factor here. But what they found was that erythrocyte esteric acids, so we got the C18, tended to be associated with CRP values, that catch-all inflammation score. Erythrocyte palmitic acid, the C16, showed a moderate association with IL-6. Only moderate, not a great p-value there. IL-6 is also a weird one in that it could be pro or anti-inflammatory, so it does need a little bit of a context, maybe through some other inflammatory markers here. But it does appear as though saturated fatty acid status does contribute towards inflammation, especially in those that already have some semblance of low-grade systemic inflammation. Maybe they're overfat or, again, an inability to oxidize. So it does appear as though the most likely culprit of inflammation with high fat dietary load and saturated fatty acid intake, especially in healthy, fit, again, metabolically flexible individuals, is lipopolysaccharide. So high fat meals could release LPS into the bloodstream for uptake, causing an immune or inflammatory response. An LPS injection in clinical trials does induce both a local and systemic inflammation, but it is dependent upon the interaction with the MD2 to TL4 receptors, those toll-like receptors. So the fate of LPS does actually appear to be contingent upon a complex interplay of lifestyle factors, dietary habits, and its interaction with your current metabolic state. So there are a lot of variables at play here. Bowser and colleagues 2020 noted that consumption of high-fat, high-sugar diets do lead to changes in the composition and activity of the gut microbiota, which increases the effect of circulating endotoxin. Bacterial endotoxin translocation through a weakened gut barrier is also the primary source of circulating endotoxin among non-septic individuals. So if you are metabolically ill, you have those inabilities to oxidize substrate, and you're constantly presenting yourself with high fat loads and high sugar loads, permeability is likely going to be a real problem for you. So Bowser and colleagues 2020, 5-day intervention. There was 13 previously sedentary males. They were 22 years of age. Fasting endotoxin following a high-fat diet, again, for 5 days, showed a significant increase. What we did see, though, was serum endotoxin post-meal was lower after 4 hours than it was at 2 hours. And my interpretation of this here is that it does suggest a detoxification process with regards to circulating endotoxin. Area under curve postprandially, though, was not significant for endotoxin. There was no changes in the study in gut or colonic permeability. Mo and colleagues in 2020 investigated this a little bit further. 2 different studies here. So we got 98 participants in the first. It was a phenotyping study. And the second, it was interventional. It was a randomized controlled trial, crossover design. So participants were fed either a high-fat breakfast or a moderate-fat breakfast and then crossed over. 4-week washout period in between. The high-fat breakfast consisted of 60% dietary fat. The moderate breakfast was 36% fat. So LPS was found to not rise significantly above fasting values with high-fat meals. Cytokine values increase significantly only after being treated with lipoprotein lipase. So it does appear as though LPS's reaction to the current metabolic state, the circulating free fatty acids that are around, it does appear to matter quite a bit. Ruiz, Nunez, and colleagues, 2016, high fiber diets, as observed in rural African populations, does appear to decrease the ratio between gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. And gram-negative bacteria is that LPS. Increased production of short-chain fatty acids improves gut integrity, which will reduce paracellular uptake of LPS. There also does appear to be a negative correlation between bifidobacterium supplementation and LPS levels. An increase in bifidobacteria induced by prebiotic intake does reduce endotoxemia. So it does appear as though if you have your shit together, your diet quality is high, LPS could be reduced. Chylomicrons, particles with the highest LPS inhibiting capacity, 70 to 75% of lauric acid, the 12-chain carbon, which does constitute the majority of coconut oil, becomes part of the chylomicron transport system. The remainder is then transported for oxidation. So enter your ability to oxidize substrates. Chylomicrons also have a rapid uptake by bodily tissue for use. Again, enter that ability to actually utilize substrate. So LPS detox, there does appear to be a few different mechanisms in which LPS may be cleared from the system. Munford notes that there are 3 different mechanisms at play here. The first is sequestration via plasma lipoproteins. Second being enzymes that may deacylate or dephosphorylate lipid A, which disrupts the natural structure of that LPS. Enhanced resiliency due to repeat exposure. So it's like the repeated bout effect, really. For example, TNF alpha response may decrease in response to LPS injection, decreasing the likelihood of NFKB expression. So Burke in 2015 investigated high-fat diet's efficacy in athletes, and she found that low-carbohydrate diet and very low-carbohydrate diet is going to result in decreased metabolic flexibility via the impairment of PDH. So right after a high-fat meal, we're going to see fat oxidation skyrocket here. And it's not just over the time course of 6 days, as this graph would indicate. It's fairly acutely also. We see carbohydrate oxidation also suffer here as well. So fatty acid oxidation rates, as noted by Bowser and colleagues here, were significantly increased following a high-fat meal. Chu in 2019 investigated 8 healthy males in a crossover design. There was 2 two-day trials, 90 minutes of moderate exercise interspersed with 4-minute bouts every 12 minutes. And they found that in a high-fat versus a low-fat diet, higher area under the curve postprandial fat oxidation rates were found in high-fat meals after high-intensity exercise. So if we're going to do activity or we're competing where carbohydrate is in high demand, this is going to be a major factor here. Ruiz, Nunez, and colleagues here in 2016 had this great graph. I thought that kind of summarized things. So we got inflammatory factors and lifestyle factors. So if you're living a poor lifestyle, you probably are more prone to inflammation here. Anti-inflammatory factors, are we living a positive lifestyle? If so, these things are going to help out quite a bit with regards to inflammation. Saturated fatty acid status and metabolic health is a big player in the game here. Carbohydrate intake, we noticed that carbohydrate intake may actually be related to de novo lipogenesis, contributing to negative saturated fatty acid status, especially in those that are already metabolically ill and do not have a large buffer via positive lifestyle and exercise and muscle mass. LPS is also a player, but buffers do actually exist here, as noted by Montford. Atherogenic lipidemia, so related to saturated fatty acid and lifestyle. And lastly, adjustment of cholesterol homeostasis. So we see the HbA axis there. Are we stressed out? Do we have metabolic flexibility? If we don't, we're going to be more prone to inflammation there. So in closing, ultimately, it does appear as though the culmination of lifestyle factors and inadequate lifestyle factors are going to dictate the extent to which saturated fatty acids and high fat loads will cause inflammation and promote atherogenic conditions.